Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the place of courage in politics. What is it, and what role does it play in times of both conflict and peace? Hello, my name is Jennifer Hudson, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We're looking this week at the role of political courage. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and everyday Ukrainians' responses have shown us numerous extraordinary examples of courage. For example, civilians who stand up to Russian tanks, of Ukraine's president who remains in Kyiv despite manifest personal danger, and of anti-war protesters in Russia who take to the streets though they know they're likely to be arrested and perhaps beaten. Courage can take many forms. So we ask in this podcast today, what exactly is it, and what role can it play in times of conflict and peace, and particularly in democratic politics? But first, we'll focus in on one kind of clearly courageous action in politics, the action of peace communities in conflict-ridden societies. We'll consider what these peace communities are, where they can be found, and when they succeed. To explore courage and peace communities, I'm delighted to be joined by two of our PhD students here in the Department of Political Science. Jennifer Hodge is a student of international relations who belongs to our conflict and change research cluster. She's created a new dataset on localized peace movements around the world and is using it to analyze their dynamics. Dusan Ribol studies political theory and is a member of our political theory research cluster. His dissertation project applies the tools of political theory to the topic of political and especially democratic courage. Dusan and Jennifer, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics.
Thanks so much. We're so delighted to be here.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Real pleasure. So let's begin with you, Jennifer, and let's begin with the example of local peace communities before we move to some general questions. Jennifer, what is a local peace community in your research?
Well, peace communities are an example of civilian mobilization in wars. So sometimes in the middle of a conflict zone, groups of ordinary local people caught up in war seek to carve out zones of peace by trying to prevent or end violence where they live. And it often happens when groups of civilians are issued with an ultimatum, or perhaps there have been a lot of massacres in the community. And rather than running away from the violence or joining an armed group that's threatening them, or even arming themselves to try to fight back using violence, these civilians instead seek to try to create a local neutral zone of peace, and they do so without arms, even though they face these threats all around them.
That's really interesting. So you've kind of hinted about the local nature of these groups. Can you give our listeners a sense of who are the kinds of people that are involved, and what are the kind of specific activities or actions that they do?
Sure. Well, actually, these are normal people. This is often a community. So they're groups of civilians that live together. So they're not NGOs. So sometimes we might see NGOs try to perform some of these actions, but these are just the ordinary civilians that live in a community that happens to be in a conflict zone. Some of the strategies that peace communities might take to demonstrate that they are a peace community is that they may publicly state their neutrality from war. So they may make a public statement, perhaps the leader of the community does this, or they may go to speak with the local armed groups in the area and discuss their intentions. They also may physically demarcate the area. So they might put up signs saying this is a peace territory or this is a peace zone. They may put fences around the territory. They may create new rules saying armed actors aren't welcome here and enforce it within the community. Or they may go on unarmed patrols. So, normal people that live there might take it in turns to walk around the territory and check that the territory is not being subject to incursions from the armed groups in the area.
So this podcast is thinking about kind of the broader concept of courage, and it doesn't take a huge leap of faith to try and understand how courage is intrinsic to local people trying to create a space for themselves in the space of conflict. Can you give us your thoughts on kind of the role of courage in the actors who take part of this activity?
Peace communities don't emerge out of nowhere. They take people. Someone has to be the first person to suggest the idea to other people that live in their community. Someone then has to go and communicate this new idea to the local armed groups of opting out of the conflict. And this is often a very dangerous thing to do, because not only does it seem really risky to try to carve out this neutral space in a very contested area in a conflict zone, it actually is. So we know empirically that when civilians try to create peace communities, they can be subject to violent retribution, in effect. This isn't necessarily the desired optimal strategy of the armed actors that are trying to gain control over the area. So what we can say is that at least one person in the community must have the courage to suggest this new idea. And then they need to incite the courage in other people in their community to join them. And these people are often known in the literature as first movers, the people that first try to create a peace community before outcomes are knowable, before others are willing to do so, and possibly at a moment where they might be presented with the greatest risks as well. So these people are really interesting to me, and I don't collect data on the first movers, or I tried to initially, actually in my data set, but then I found that finding out who tries to create the peace communities is actually quite difficult. And then I also considered the sort of ethical dimension as well of collecting this individual level of information. And that was another reason that I decided not to pursue that line of thought for the data set, at least.
So it's really fascinating, Jennifer. And when you're talking about courage here, that just strikes me as courage implies vulnerability, because certainly the first movers are putting themselves in a position of vulnerability, as are those who join in these local peace movements. It would be really interesting, I think, for our listeners to hear a little bit more about kind of your research journey. How did you become interested in studying local peace communities?
So when I was reading about peace communities, cases of peace communities, I was really surprised about the fact that civilians do this at all. That sometimes in the middle of a war zone, civilians would choose to risk their lives by publicly stating their opposition to the conflict. In the middle of conflict, it seems sort of counterintuitive to me. And so I was really interested in trying to understand how much of a sort of general phenomenon this is. I read about a couple of cases in Colombia, and then I realized that at least in Colombia, it seemed as though there were quite a lot of potentially similar cases. So this got me more intrigued.
Could you give us an example of kind of the key questions that you're asking in this research?
Of course. So there are two main research questions for my research. The first is, under what conditions do peace communities emerge? So this comes out of the curiosity of the fact that this phenomenon even exists. And then the second one is, under what conditions are peace communities successful? So this is much more about their fortunes once they emerge. Are there ways that external actors can perhaps support peace communities to last longer? Or are there ways of reducing victimization of civilians that live in these peace communities? So I was curious about a number of sort of related questions about this phenomenon. And I was also curious about the extent to which this generalizes beyond the Colombian case as well.
That's really fascinating. And clearly your work has real world implications, but I'm not going to ask about that yet. We'll maybe save that until the end. I want to talk about this data set that you're building. Because trying to understand this phenomenon sounds like it really requires kind of some new data, some new empirics to understand their formation and their success. So describe for our listeners the data set.
Sure. So I've created a data set that is that includes 69 peace communities. These are mapped to over 1,100 villages. And I've also mapped some peace communities are in a coalition of peace communities, so they act together. So I've also included information on that as well. And I searched in 10 countries around the world. So all the major regions are included in the sample. But we only found peace communities in 5. And I say we because I've had some help along the way of creating this data set. I've been really lucky to get help in 2 main parts of the process. So the first was that I ran a mentorship program here at UCL, which was fantastic. So this involved recruiting. I initially only wanted a couple of undergrads to do this with me, but I got so many inquiries that in the end 10 students worked with me on developing the code book and the search protocol and testing the keywords to find peace communities. So we worked on it for around 12 weeks, and I taught them about data collection, and we discussed peace communities as a concept, and we sort of discussed particular cases that they found together, and it was really fun. And at the end of that, we had a concrete search protocol that's standard and is used across all the cases that we searched in. We also had a code book, and in the code book are many variables that relate to all of these sort of different parts of the phenomenon that I'm interested in. And we searched in the literature, we did a systematic search, we searched UNDP reports, and we also reviewed seminal volumes of peace communities. And all of this has brought together the data set, which hopefully soon I'll be able to release for publication.
That's really fantastic. You know, yourself in a position as a PhD researcher, working with undergrads to kind of build this pipeline, hopefully in a research community. So fantastic, fantastic work there. You know, I know you're still doing quite a lot of the work and the analysis, but can you give our audience a little bit of insight into what you're finding so far in terms of what makes the creation of a local peace community more likely, and conditions for their success?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, I'm still analysing the data, and I wouldn't want to rush to state too much in case. But what I can say is that the duration of peace communities does seem to vary by a number of community level characteristics. And also it varies to do with the strategies of the peace communities. So one of the findings that I've found is that when peace communities decide to negotiate with the armed groups before they set a peace community up, they last on average 4 years longer. So this process of going around and getting buy-in before creating a peace community seems important to the sustenance of the peace community after it's been formed. And then the question about, you know, under what conditions do peace communities emerge? Well, there's several initial findings that I have. So for one, unsurprisingly, peace communities tend to emerge in areas of territorial contestation. And what this means is that peace communities don't emerge in places where there's just one armed actor present. They emerge in places where there are at least 2 armed groups. And the reason for this, I think, plays into some of the narration I've given of examples, in a way, of how peace communities tend to emerge. They tend to emerge in areas of contestation between armed actors who are trying to perhaps ensure civilian loyalty on one side or another, and that might often involves the use of force. So it's unsurprising that peace communities might emerge as a response to perhaps they've already tried to join one armed group. That hasn't worked. Then they perhaps try to join with another. That doesn't work. And then this is a response. This is a new idea. It's not necessarily the first idea that a community might come up to in response to these conditions. So this makes sense. Another initial finding is the fact that peace communities seem to emerge in areas that have been subject to higher levels of massacres. And this is different to homicides. So homicides are an individual level form of violence. It's one person kills another. Whereas massacres are a form of collective violence, collective targeting. And so theoretically, it makes sense that this collective violence would trigger a collective level community response as well. And the final finding that we could talk about now is that peace communities seem to diffuse in space. So a very important predictor of the emergence of a new peace community is whether or not in the prior year a peace community existed in this territory. And the reason that I think this makes sense, again, is because as a strategy, civilians in the middle of war zones, they are always seeking new ideas for how to protect themselves and their families. And if there's a new strategy that's launched, perhaps nearby, word of mouth might spread of this new idea, this new possible response to conflict dynamics. And I think that this explains well why we might see this diffusion effect in space.
That's really fascinating, Jennifer. And I alluded to some real world implications of your research, and they're really clear. Maybe you want to kind of share what you think would be the lessons learned so far, how you might translate this to policymakers, or are you working with kind of external bodies on the ground in some of these locations that you're studying to think about how you might share the insight of your research?
Well, when I've finished all of my analysis, I do hope to provide outcome reports to NGOs that directly work with these communities. But I'm not yet at that stage, although I hope to be by the end of the year, as I am finishing up this year. Because I do think that there are a lot of potential real world implications, in particular in terms of the timing and types of support that NGOs and faith institutions also provide to civilians. And one theory that I want to test, and I haven't yet, but I'm really looking forward to doing so, is to test my hunch that it matters when NGOs provide support to civilians. So we can imagine theoretically that it should make a difference whether or not a peace community receives support at the beginning of its lifespan and then throughout its lifespan, or whether that support is just provided at the beginning. And the reason that I think this sort of temporal dimension matters is that peace communities that receive support and then later perhaps have that support withdrawn may find themselves in a situation where the community itself alone doesn't actually have the resilience, the skills, the experience alone to continue to sustain the strategy. And this could have a really important real world implication because civilians, by creating a peace community, are stating their opposition to all armed actors. They're stating their opposition to the war. So this can be interpreted as disloyalty, perhaps, by some armed actors in a conflict. And once that support's withdrawn, that could lead to targeting, perhaps more so than if the peace community had ever been created at all. And this is a question that I think is really important, and I hope to analyse soon with my data set.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to pivot now and turn to Dushan and talk about the political theory of courage. So moving away perhaps from kind of a conflict or contested area. Dushan, welcome. Why is it important for us to think about the role of courage in a democracy?
When I listened to the conversation just now, I very much picked up on this idea of the first mover within a peace community. So an actor, an agent who's possessed of a certain quality that allows them to undertake serious risks in the service of their community's survival. Now, that's the model of a courageous person within a tradition in which I'm working. So the answer to the question of why we should care about courage and democracy is this. Courage is the capacity or a set of capacities that help people living under any kind of political system, not just democracy, to navigate political uncertainty by taking big but calculated risks in service of noble political ends. And most associated with courage traditionally has been freedom. Not just any type of freedom, but the sort of freedom that's enjoyed by people who conduct their common affairs in the absence of a threat that someone will impose their will on them. Now, this could be an invader, could be a domestic tyrant, could be an economic exploiter, could be like a class of economic exploiters, or maybe it could be an oppressive majority of some kind. Now, contemporary political theorists some political theorists think that the political prerequisite for that type of freedom is precisely a well-functioning democratic system. So I'm interested first in how courage limits the capacity for will imposition or domination in democracies, and secondly, what democratic morality requires of people who act courageously in contexts where that's relevant.
Thank you for that. And let's pick into a little bit of your definition there, if that's okay. You lay out in your research that courage just isn't acting in spite of risk, that it involves making that calculation of risk, and doing so in pursuit of a moral purpose. So tell me, if you can, in kind of everyday terms, tell us about the calculation of risk. That's really important here. And give us an example of some moral purposes in democracies that people think about.
Well, perhaps about the calculation of risks first. Why did I include that? Why is it important to be calculating about the risks? Now, I should note that my source here mostly are the classical Republican accounts of courage as embedded within the four cardinal virtues, okay? And particularly Cicero, in his work on duties, presents courage as synonymous, or not synonymous, but certainly informed by what he terms wisdom or practical wisdom. Now, practical wisdom means being aware of your situation so that you can choose from available alternatives and therefore be better capable of realizing whatever your ideal of justice tells you is the right thing to do in this particular situation. So you cannot really go into that kind of selection of available alternatives if you don't sort of gauge what the risks are. Now, risks, of course, are important because the risks aren't sufficiently high. Your action likely could not be described as courageous. And now, sort of about the worthy goals, about the noble ends. Now, noble ends have to do, as you say, with some idea of justice, and justice is the type of morality that tells you what is owed to other people. So in terms, if we talk about democratic courage, so the type of courage that's informed by democratic morality, the worthiest of ends would probably be those having to do with maintaining and buttressing a democratic order. Now, for instance, in democracies, what would be examples of those types of actions that buttress democratic principles? In the context of democratic politics, of peacetime democratic politics, in which I'm most interested, we certainly, to maintain a democratic order by engaging in courageous action, examples of that would be members of popular movements who sort of risk loss of employment or reputational damage, or in some cases incarceration, police violence, in the process of labor struggles, civil rights struggles. Then we need courageous leaders to occasionally sort of battle public opinion, and also pressures of powerful non-state or superstate actors to ensure the common good. And of course, we need courageous whistleblowers, right, to expose abuses of power in like the public and the private sectors. So when we talk about courage, we always want to refer to certain models of courage, to sort of portraits of courage. So Eugene Debs, right? Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, the people who in East London's battle for Cable Street fought Oswald Mosley's fascists, right? These are all historical examples of people engaged in social movements who, through sort of self-sacrifice and endangerment, self-endangerment, had a democratizing and some would say a civilizing effect on their political communities. Now, also, I think a case could be made there, sort of in their capacity as political leaders in Greece. Yanis Varoufakis and Alexis Tsipras, although they found themselves at the opposite positions regarding the problem that they were discussing, displayed a particular kind of courage when they tried to navigate these different pressures of their voters on one hand and of the Eurogroup on the other. And finally, well, not everyone likes these figures, but I think you'd have a fairly hard time denying that, considering their sacrifices, people like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange are incredibly courageous.
Thanks, Dusan, for laying that out. I suppose, we've been thinking about and talking about courage in democratic society and democratic politics in a really positive lens or a positive frame. And you highlight in your research that there might be some downsides to courage. First, it might be there's the kind of belligerent individual who is acting courageously, but is prone to conflict, is not really thinking about the common good, and so therefore may be acting courageously, but without the best outcomes for the largest number of people. The alternate, another criticism or potential negative you highlight is it possible that courage becomes a protecting our own against an other, so that we might then be using courage, or courage may be seen to be kind of reinforcing a we and they politics, or an in-group and an out-group kind of politics. How serious should we take, I think, these concerns about courage?
Well, these are both, I think, very relevant and, in a certain way, even classical objections, especially the objection about, the courageous person who is prone to belligerence and not getting along with others, not minding other people's opinions or safety. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's been said about courage probably since the Enlightenment. But yeah, more permanently, the problem with courage will be that there simply is a statistical correlation between group conflict and people's willingness to sacrifice for others. And to the extent that overlaps with courage, this, of course, can be disheartening, right? Because, okay, if we think that perhaps in the not too distant future, for example, countries less impacted by climate change, for instance, will have to decide between the courage required to help those displaced by climate change or the courage required to fight what they will perceive as the onslaught of climate migrants. There are reasons to worry which type they will choose.
That's a fascinating kind of trade-off that you've presented there in terms of thinking about the big challenge around climate, and winners and losers, and courage within that context. I guess, Dusan, is kind of putting you on the spot here, given that there are certainly benefits to courage and there are costs potentially to courage. What should our approach to courage in democratic politics be? Where is your research or your conclusions taking us in this regard?
Well, I think in a way we won't need to worry too much about our approach to courage, because, okay, first of all, courage is rare, right? And this is an empirical question, but I don't know that we could reliably teach it, because, to a degree, people can be habituated to danger and they can learn to manage fear which I think certain aspects of Jennifer's research reveal with regard to first movers. But I mean, doing that for noble ends, predictably, that's a different matter. So in any case, an abundance of courage that's not likely to be a problem. But I mean, the examples I gave earlier showed that it's far from certain that sort of disregard for others is necessarily a feature of courage, or even often, right? So I think considering the challenges, like the challenge of global warming, and I mean, incredibly, the challenge of, or a threat of, a nuclear exchange between superpowers again, well, I think we should take care to welcome courage when we see it.
So I'm going to bring this to a close, and some really interesting food for thought here around courage. And I'm minded, Dushan, you ended there by saying that courage is rare, and I think I would agree with you when we think about these kind of major acts of courage. If we think about Rosa Parks or Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. But I guess I'll leave it with you to a challenge to you about everyday acts of courage in politics, and how that sits against the kind of bigger and kind of more impactful acts. So Jennifer, reflecting on this discussion on courage, thinking about your work about local peacekeeping, about local peace communities. What are your thoughts? Big courage, everyday acts of courage. How much do we need?
Well, it seems clear that we need courage. There always needs to be at least one person that's willing to take on the extraordinary risks, and it's a good thing that that's distributed in the population. We don't want to have too many courageous people. I don't know what that would lead to, but we certainly need some courageous people, some altruistic people, perhaps, who are able to disregard their own personal risk at times for what they perceive to be a really important political cause.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Dushan, space in democratic politics for everyday acts of courage?
There might be a little bit of a paradox here, which will be very unsatisfying, I'm afraid. Of course, we want to see courage in everyday life, in democratic politics especially. I mean, from our leaders, from ourselves, although that's where the paradox comes in, because if we have a well-functioning democracy, then ideally, courage shouldn't be required of us too often. It shouldn't be required of us to do things like vote. I think we should expect of a democracy that it shouldn't take courage to vote or to engage in activities of political contestation. If we come to a point where larger amounts of courage are required, that will probably mean that we live in perilous times, and times that are also perilous for democracy.
I think that rounds us out really, really nicely, Dushan. Thank you so much for your reflections, Jennifer. Thank you for yours. In our next podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into a new book on the origins of secular institutions, examining historical and statistical evidence across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa from the mid-19th century to the present day. As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe, and you can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Jennifer Hudson. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you very much for listening.